I was 3 steps from dying in that dust when he rode up. A stranger who saw straight through my pride and asked just one question: "Will you let me help you live?" This is the story of how a widow with nothing left found everything she'd stopped believing in. It's about the moment you choose to stop falling and start building. Stay with me until the very end and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because sometimes the person who saves you isn't the one you expected. Sometimes it's the one who refuses to let you disappear. The sun didn't just shine that day, it punished. Clara Holt stood in the middle of a landscape that looked like God had forgotten it existed, her boots sinking into dust so fine it might as well have been ash. The prairie stretched in every direction, bleached pale and lifeless, the kind of emptiness that made you understand why some people just lay down and didn't get back up. Behind her, pressed against the splintered remains of a fence that had given up years before she had, 3 children sat in silence. They'd stopped crying 2 days ago. That was when Clara knew they'd crossed some invisible line, the one between hardship and something much darker. Her daughter, Eliza, was 7. She had her father's eyes, though Clara tried not to notice that anymore. The girl sat with her arms wrapped around her younger brothers, Samuel, 5, and baby Thomas, barely 3. All of them huddled beneath a blanket so worn you could see daylight through the threads. Clara's hands trembled as she stared at the horizon, searching for something that wasn't there. Hope, maybe. Help. A reason to take another step. The wagon had broken 6 miles back, the axle snapping with a sound like a gunshot that had made all 3 children scream. She'd stood there in the road, staring at the splintered wood, and for the first time since her husband died, she'd felt something worse than grief. She'd felt nothing at all. "Mama?" Eliza's voice was small, scraped raw from thirst. "Are we going to keep walking?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. What was she supposed to say? That she didn't know where they were walking to? That the town of San Loup, 5 miles behind them, had made it clear there was no room for a widow and 3 hungry mouths? That every door she'd knocked on had opened just wide enough for her to see pity in their eyes before it closed again? "We'll rest a bit longer," Clara finally managed, her voice cracking. Samuel shifted under the blanket, his face flushed with heat. "I'm thirsty." "I know, baby. My stomach hurts." "I know." Thomas started to whimper, a weak, defeated sound that made Clara's chest tighten until she couldn't breathe. She turned away from them, pressing her fist against her mouth to keep from making a sound that would scare them more than they already were. This was how it ended, she thought, not with violence or drama, but with slow surrender under a merciless sun. Her husband, James, had been a good man. Not wealthy, not particularly ambitious, but steady, kind. He'd worked a small plot of land on the edge of Price territory, raising enough crops to keep them fed and a few head of cattle to trade when times got tough. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs. Then the storm came. Lightning had split the sky on a July evening, striking so close Clara had felt the thunder in her bones. James had been out checking the animals, making sure they were secured before the worst of it hit. She'd watched from the window as the world turned white, then dark, then white again. She'd found him an hour later, lying in the mud near the barn, his body still and cold despite the warm rain. The land had gone to the bank within a month. The cattle had been sold to pay debts she hadn't known existed. And the people of San Loup, good Christian folk who smiled on Sundays, had made it quietly clear that a woman alone with 3 children was a problem they didn't intend to solve. So she'd packed what little remained into a borrowed wagon and started north, toward a cousin she hadn't seen in 10 years and wasn't sure would remember her name. She hadn't made it 20 miles. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the sun beat down on her head like a hammer. The smart thing would be to wait until evening, when the temperature dropped. But evening was hours away, and she wasn't sure Thomas would last that long without water. She was just about to gather the children and force herself to move when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow. Steady. Unhurried. Clara's eyes snapped open, her body tensing instinctively. Out here, a stranger could mean help or danger, and she'd learned the hard way that telling the difference wasn't always easy until it was too late. The rider appeared from the north, emerging from the heat shimmer like something conjured from a dream. A man on horseback, moving at an easy pace, his hat pulled low against the sun. Clara stepped in front of her children without thinking, her hand moving to the knife she kept in her belt. It wasn't much. A dull blade James had used for whittling, but it was all she had. The rider slowed as he approached, then stopped about 20 feet away. He didn't dismount, didn't speak, just sat there, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that looked like they'd seen enough to understand silence. He wore a dusty shirt, work-worn pants, and a kerchief tied loose around his neck. A ranch hand, by the look of him. Someone used to long days and hard labor. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice low and even. Clara didn't respond. She kept her hand on the knife, her jaw set. The man's gaze moved past her to the children, then to the broken fence, the torn blanket, the emptiness stretching in every direction. When his eyes came back to her face, something in his expression shifted. Not pity, something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. "How long you been out here?" he asked. "Long enough," Clara said, her voice harder than she felt. The man nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. He shifted in the saddle and Clara's grip tightened on the knife. But he didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he pulled a cloth bundle from his saddlebag and held it out toward her. "Cornbread," he said simply, "and there's a canteen on my other side. Water's still cool." Clara stared at the bundle, her throat tight. "I don't have money." "Didn't ask for any." "I don't need charity." The man's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "No, ma'am, I imagine you don't. But those kids behind you need something, and pride won't fill their bellies." Clara felt something crack inside her chest. She wanted to argue, to send him away, to prove she could handle this on her own. But Samuel was whimpering again, and Eliza was watching her with eyes that had learned not to hope for much. The stranger seemed to sense her hesitation. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements careful and visible, and walked halfway toward her before setting the bundle and canteen on the ground. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said quietly, "but I'm asking you to feed your children." Then he stepped back, giving her space. Clara waited until he'd returned to his horse before moving forward. She picked up the bundle with shaking hands, unwrapping it to reveal thick slices of cornbread, still soft. The canteen was heavy, sloshing with clean water. She carried it back to the fence where Eliza immediately reached for the canteen. Clara helped her tip it carefully, watching Samuel and Thomas take desperate gulps. "Slow," she murmured. "Slow, or you'll be sick." When the children had drunk their fill, she broke the cornbread into pieces, dividing it evenly. They ate in silence, and Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes at the simple sound of them chewing. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear them eat. When she finally looked back at the stranger, he was still there, standing beside his horse, watching the horizon like he had all the time in the world. "Why?" Clara asked, her voice barely carrying across the distance between them. The man turned, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Why what? Why stop? Why help?" He was quiet for a long moment, then shrugged. "Saw someone who needed it?" "You don't know me." "No, ma'am, I don't. I could be anyone. I could be—" "You're a woman with 3 children in the middle of nowhere," the man interrupted gently. "Don't need to know more than that." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. "What's your name?" she asked. "Rhett Carver. I work for the Price Ranch, about 8 miles north of here." "I'm Clara Holt." Rhett nodded, committing it to memory. "You headed somewhere specific, Mrs. Holt?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "Had a plan. Didn't work out." "You got people waiting for you? Someone who'll come looking?" The question was casual, but Clara heard the weight beneath it. He was asking if anyone would care if she disappeared. "No," she said quietly. "No one's looking." Rhett's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of reaction. He glanced back at the children who were finishing the last of the cornbread, then back at Clara. "There's a place," he said slowly. "Not fancy, but it's got walls and a roof. Bunkhouse on the edge of Price Land. Used to house seasonal workers, but it's been empty since spring." Clara's spine stiffened. "I told you, I don't need charity." "And I'm not offering it," Rhett replied, his tone steady. "I'm offering work. Place needs cleaning, repairs, garden needs tending. You do that, you and the kids get food and shelter. Fair trade. And what do you get out of it? Rhett met her eyes directly. Place stops falling apart. That's it. Clara wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But she'd learned the hard way that kindness usually came with strings attached, expectations that got heavier the longer you stayed. I don't know you, she said again. No, ma'am, Rhett agreed. But you know this. You got about 4 hours of daylight left, and that baby of yours isn't going to make it through another night out here without shelter. The words were brutal, but they were true. Clara looked at Thomas, saw the flush in his cheeks, the way his breathing had gone shallow. Rhett seemed to sense her wavering. I'll ride ahead. Make sure the place is cleared out. You follow at your own pace. Door will be open. You decide you don't like what you see. You keep walking. No questions asked. He moved to mount his horse, then paused, looking back at her one more time. You don't owe me a thing, Mrs. Holt, but you need strength if they're going to see another week. And right now, you're running out of both. Before Clara could respond, he swung into the saddle and turned his horse north. He rode about 50 yards, then stopped and looked back. Follow the fence line, he called. Stay straight for about 6 miles, then you'll see a windmill. Turn east there. Can't miss it. Then he was gone, disappearing into the heat shimmer the same way he'd appeared. Clara stood frozen, the empty canteen in her hands, her children watching her with quiet expectation. Samuel tugged at her skirt. Mama, are we going with the cowboy? Clara looked down at her son's face, dirt-streaked, hopeful, so desperately trusting, and felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the first faint whisper of something she'd thought had died with her husband. Maybe it was the simple, terrifying possibility that someone had offered help without expecting her to break herself in return. Yeah, baby, she whispered, pulling him close. We're going. The walk to the windmill took 3 hours. Clara carried Thomas on her hip, his small body heavy with heat and exhaustion. Eliza and Samuel walked beside her, holding hands, neither of them complaining, even though Clara knew their feet had to be blistered inside their worn shoes. The sun continued its relentless assault, and more than once Clara had to stop and close her eyes against the dizziness that swept through her. But each time she thought about sitting down, about giving up, she remembered Rhett's words. You need strength if they're going to see another week. So she kept walking. The windmill appeared as promised, a skeletal structure creaking in the dry wind. Clara turned east as instructed, following a rutted path that cut through tall, brittle grass. 20 minutes later, she saw it. The bunkhouse sat in a small hollow, partially shaded by a cluster of cottonwood trees that looked like they were barely surviving. It was a simple structure, rough wood, a shingled roof, a narrow porch that sagged on one end. But it had walls, and a door, and windows that still held glass. Rhett's horse was tied to a post near the porch, and as Clara approached, he stepped out of the building, a broom in his hands. Just finishing up, he said, setting the broom aside. Place was dustier than I remembered. Clara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly uncertain. Up close, the bunkhouse looked even more worn, paint peeling, boards warped by years of heat and weather. But it was shelter, real shelter. There's a pump out back, Rhett continued, gesturing around the side of the building. Water runs clean. I brought some supplies, beans, flour, salt pork. Enough to get you through a few days while you figure out what you need. Clara's throat was too tight to speak. She just nodded. Rhett seemed to understand. He stepped down from the porch, careful to keep a respectful distance, and crouched so he was eye level with the children. You 3 must be tired, he said gently. There's beds inside, not fancy, but they're better than the ground. Eliza looked at her mother, waiting for permission. Clara managed a small nod, and the girl took her brother's hands and led them up the steps. Clara watched them disappear inside, then finally looked at Rhett. Why are you doing this? Rhett stood, brushing dust from his knees. Told you already. No, you gave me reasons, but those aren't answers. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Lost my mother when I was about Samuel's age. My father tried, but he wasn't much good at raising kids on his own. We ended up on the move for years, working ranches, sleeping in barns, taking whatever charity folks were willing to give. I remember what it felt like to be hungry, to be scared, to watch my father try to hide how close we were to the edge. He looked back at Clara, and she saw something in his eyes she recognized, the particular kind of scar that comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Someone helped us, Rhett said simply. Man named Price gave my father steady work. Let us stay in a place just like this. Didn't ask for anything except honest labor. That kindness saved us. So you're paying it forward. Something like that. Clara felt tears threatening again, and she blinked them back furiously. I'm not good at accepting help. I noticed. Despite everything, Clara felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. I mean it. I've spent the last 4 months learning that people's generosity usually comes with expectations I can't meet. Then it's good I'm not expecting anything. Everyone expects something. Rhett shook his head slowly. I expect you'll work hard because that's who you are. I expect you'll take care of those kids because you already have been, even when it nearly killed you. And I expect you'll leave the day you feel like staying costs more than it's worth. That's it. The simplicity of it almost undid her. No demands, no conditions, just space to breathe. I don't know how to thank you, Clara whispered. Don't need thanks. Just need you to survive. Rhett moved toward his horse, untying the reins. Clara watched him mount, her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to ask. Will you? She started, then stopped. Rhett looked back at her, patient. Will you come back? Clara finished quietly. To check on us, I mean. Make sure we're managing. Something shifted in Rhett's expression, a softness she hadn't seen before. I'll come by tomorrow morning, bring more supplies, show you where everything is. Okay. He started to turn his horse, then paused. Mrs. Holt? Yes. You made it here. That's more than surviving. That's strength. Before Clara could respond, he rode away, disappearing down the rutted path toward the main ranch. Clara stood alone in the fading light, staring at the bunkhouse that would be their home. From inside, she could hear Eliza's voice, soft and wondering, and Samuel's lighter tones responding. They were talking, really talking, in a way they hadn't in weeks. Clara climbed the steps slowly, her body aching with exhaustion. She pushed open the door and found her children exploring the single large room with something that looked almost like joy. Mama, look! Samuel called, pointing to a small stove in the corner. We can cook inside. And there's beds, Eliza added, sitting on one of 3 narrow cots lined against the wall. Real beds with mattresses. Thomas had already crawled onto another cot and was lying down, his eyes drooping. Clara moved through the room, taking inventory. It wasn't much. Rough furniture, bare walls, a floor that needed scrubbing. But it was clean, dry, safe. She found the supplies Rhett had mentioned stacked neatly on a small table. Beans, flour, coffee, salt pork, even a jar of honey. Her hands trembled as she touched each item, unable to quite believe they were real. That night, Clara made a simple supper of beans and cornbread over the small stove. They ate sitting on the floor, and for the first time in months, no one went to bed hungry. She tucked the children into their cots, kissing each forehead, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. When they were asleep, Clara sat on the porch in the darkness, listening to the crickets and the distant creak of the windmill. The air was still warm from the day's heat, but it felt different here, lighter somehow. She thought about Rhett, the quiet certainty in his voice, the way he'd looked at her without judgment or pity. Just recognition. You weren't broken, just tired of walking alone. He hadn't said those words yet, but somehow Clara felt them anyway. She pulled her knees to her chest and finally let herself cry. Not from despair this time, but from the overwhelming, terrifying relief of being offered a chance to rest. Tomorrow would bring work, questions, uncertainty about what came next. But tonight, her children were safe and fed and sleeping in real beds. Tonight, that was enough. Clara stayed on the porch until the moon rose high and bright, painting the prairie in shades of silver. And somewhere in the darkness, she felt the first fragile thread of hope beginning to weave itself back into her heart. She wasn't saved yet, wasn't healed, but she was here. And for the first time since James died, that felt like it might be enough to build on. The sun hadn't fully risen when Clara heard the hoofbeats returning. She'd been awake for over an hour, unable to sleep past dawn despite the exhaustion that still clung to her bones. The children were still curled in their cots, breathing the deep, peaceful rhythms of real rest, and Clara had been reluctant to disturb them. Instead, she'd stepped outside to watch the sky lighten from black to purple to pale gold, marveling at how different the world looked when you weren't certain you'd die in it. Rhett appeared from the west, his horse moving at that same unhurried pace, a pack secured behind his saddle. He raised a hand in greeting as he approached, and Clara found herself returning the gesture before she'd consciously decided to. He dismounted near the porch, pulling the pack down with him. "Morning, Mrs. Holt. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted, then felt oddly vulnerable for saying it out loud. If Rhett noticed her discomfort, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and gestured to the pack. "Brought some things I thought you might need. Soap, lamp oil, matches, few other supplies." "Mr. Carver, I can't keep taking—" "It's Rhett," he interrupted gently, "and you're not taking. You're accepting what's offered. There's a difference." Clara bit back her protest, watching as he carried the pack to the porch and set it down carefully. He moved with the efficiency of someone used to working alone, no wasted motion, no expectation of thanks. "I was thinking," Rhett said, straightening up, "if you're willing, I could show you around the property today. Where the good water is, what needs fixing, where the garden plot used to be. Help you get your bearings." Clara glanced back at the door, thinking of her sleeping children. "I should wait for them to wake up." "That's fine. I've got time." He said it so simply, like his time wasn't valuable, like waiting on her convenience was the most natural thing in the world. Clara wasn't sure what to do with that kind of patience. "There's coffee," she offered hesitantly. "I made it on the stove. It's not— I don't know if it's any good, but I'd appreciate that, ma'am." They sat on the porch steps, two people who were still mostly strangers sharing coffee as the prairie came alive around them. Birds called from the cottonwoods, insects hummed in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed their morning complaints. "How long have you worked for Mr. Price?" Clara asked, more to fill the silence than from genuine curiosity. "Coming up on 12 years now. Started when I was 18, fresh off my father's death. Mr. Price gave me a job when I had nothing to recommend me but desperation and a willingness to work." "Your father, the one who raised you after your mother passed?" Rhett nodded, staring into his coffee. "Pneumonia took him one winter, same thing that killed my mother, as it turned out. Felt like some kind of cruel joke from God." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He paused, then added quietly, "But I remember what it felt like to be alone, to wonder if anyone would notice if I just stopped trying." Clara's hands tightened around her cup. "And did you?" "Stop trying. Thought about it, got real close a few times." Rhett looked at her directly, his eyes serious. "But then I'd think about my mother, about how hard she fought to give me and my father even one more day together. Seemed disrespectful to waste what she'd bled for." The words settled between them, heavy with understanding. Clara had thought similar things in the months since James died. How he'd given everything to provide for them, how abandoning his children would be the ultimate betrayal of his sacrifice. But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your bones were two different things entirely. "I was ready to give up," Clara heard herself say. "Yesterday, before you came, I was ready to just stop." Rhett didn't look shocked or disapproving. He just nodded slowly. "But you didn't." "Only because you showed up." "No, ma'am. I showed up, but you made the choice to keep going. Those are different things." Before Clara could respond, the door creaked open behind them. Eliza appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair a wild tangle around her face. "Mama? Is that the cowboy?" Clara felt her cheeks warm, though she couldn't say why. "This is Mr. Carver, sweetheart. He's the one who helped us yesterday." Rhett stood, removing his hat. "Morning, miss. You must be Eliza." The girl's eyes widened. "How'd you know my name?" "Your mama mentioned it." Rhett crouched down to her level, his movements slow and non-threatening. "I was just telling her I'd like to show you all around today, if that's all right. There's a good spot for catching grasshoppers down by the creek, if you're interested." Eliza's face lit up with an enthusiasm Clara hadn't seen in months. Samuel loves grasshoppers. Can I wake him up? Let him sleep a bit longer, Clara said. We'll have breakfast first. But Samuel and Thomas were already stirring, drawn by the sound of voices and the promise of something interesting happening. Within minutes, all three children were on the porch, eyeing Rhett with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Clara cooked a simple breakfast of fried salt pork and cornmeal mush, stretching the supplies as far as they'd go. The children ate with better appetite than they'd had in weeks, and Clara felt something in her chest ease at the sight of them actually finishing their portions. Rhett ate with them, answering Samuel's endless questions about horses and cattle and whether he'd ever shot a bear. He was patient with the boy's enthusiasm, never talking down to him, treating each question like it deserved a real answer. Bears are scarce around here, Rhett explained, wiping his plate clean with a piece of cornbread. Mostly you see coyotes, maybe a mountain lion if you're unlucky. Best thing is to make noise when you're walking around. They'll usually clear out before you even know they were there. What if they don't? Samuel pressed, his eyes wide. Then you make yourself big, make lots of noise, and back away slow. Never run. Running makes you look like prey. Eliza shivered dramatically. I don't want to see a mountain lion. You probably won't, Rhett assured her. They're smart enough to avoid people, but it's good to know what to do, just in case. After breakfast, Rhett kept his promise, leading them on a tour of the property. The bunkhouse sat on about 3 acres of price land, far enough from the main ranch to offer privacy, but close enough that help was available if needed. He showed them the pump behind the house, demonstrating how to prime it properly. The water that gushed out was cold and clear, tasting of minerals and earth. Samuel insisted on trying it himself, pumping the handle with both hands until water splashed over his boots. There's a creek about a quarter mile that way, Rhett said, pointing east. Runs year-round, even in dry seasons. Good for washing clothes, cooling off when the heat gets bad. But don't drink from it. Use the pump for drinking water. Clara nodded, committing everything to memory. She'd need to teach the children these rules, make sure they understood which water was safe and which wasn't. The garden plot was farther from the house, a rectangular patch of earth bordered by rocks and old fence posts. It was overgrown now, choked with weeds and brittle grass, but Clara could see the potential in it. This produced good vegetables a few years back, Rhett said, kicking at the dry soil. Tomatoes, squash, beans. Soil's decent if you work it right, keep it watered. Be a lot of labor to get it going again, though. Clara knelt, running her fingers through the earth. It was hard-packed from neglect, but not beyond saving. I can do it. Used to help my mother with her garden when I was a girl. You'll need tools, hoe, rake, maybe a spade. I can bring some by. I can't keep taking your things, Mr. Carver. Rhett, he corrected again, and they're not my things. They belong to the ranch. You're working ranch land now, which means ranch tools are yours to use. The logic was sound, but Clara still felt the weight of obligation settling on her shoulders. Nothing was truly free. She'd learned that the hard way. But when she looked at Rhett's face, she saw no hint of ulterior motive, no suggestion that his help came with strings attached. Maybe, she thought, some people really were just kind. They walked the fence line next, Rhett pointing out which sections needed repair, where the posts had rotted through, where the wire had come loose. It was overwhelming, the amount of work that needed doing, but it was also oddly reassuring. Work meant purpose. Purpose meant reason to stay. The children ran ahead, chasing grasshoppers through the tall grass, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Clara watched them with something close to wonder. When was the last time they'd played? Really played, without fear or hunger gnawing at them? They're good kids, Rhett observed, following her gaze. They are. They've been through more than children should have to endure. Same could be said for their mother. Clara glanced at him, startled by the quiet respect in his voice. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's what strength is, Mrs. Holt. Doing what needs to be done even when everything in you wants to quit. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the sun climbing higher, the day's heat beginning to build. Clara found herself relaxing in increments, her shoulders dropping from around her ears, her jaw unclenching for the first time in months. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Of course. Why this place? Why offer me work here instead of at the main ranch? Rhett was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Maine Ranch is full of men, rough men, mostly decent but loud and, well, not always respectful of women. Figured you'd been through enough without having to navigate that kind of atmosphere. Clara felt a flash of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. He'd thought about her safety, her comfort, her dignity. Small considerations that meant everything. And honestly, Rhett continued, this place has been falling apart for 2 years. Mr. Price keeps talking about tearing it down, but I've been arguing we should keep it, fix it up for seasonal workers. You doing the repairs gives me ammunition to win that argument. So I'm helping you as much as you're helping me. Seems fair. They reached the creek, a narrow ribbon of water cutting through the prairie, bordered by cattails and scrub brush. The children immediately kicked off their shoes and waded in, shrieking at the cold. Clara watched them splash and play, their faces bright with uncomplicated joy. Thomas scooped water in his small hands, trying to catch the tiny fish that darted away from his pudgy fingers. Eliza showed Samuel how to skip stones, though most of his attempts ended in spectacular belly flops that sent up huge splashes. Thank you, Clara said quietly, not looking at Rhett. Not just for the food and the shelter, but for this, for giving them a reason to laugh again. They deserve it. So do you, I think. Rhett turned to her, surprised. Ma'am? You do all this helping, all this giving. When do you get to rest? When does someone take care of you? Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. I manage. That's not what I asked. Rhett looked back at the children, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Maybe helping is how I rest. Maybe taking care of folks who need it is what keeps me going. Clara understood that. Understood it in her bones. Sometimes the only way to survive your own pain was to ease someone else's. They spent the rest of the morning by the creek, the children playing while Clara and Rhett sat in the shade of a cottonwood, talking about nothing important and everything essential. He told her about the ranch, about Mr. Price's 3 daughters, who'd all married and moved away, about the other hands and their various quirks and talents. She told him about James, about the farm they'd lost, about the slow suffocation of watching doors close one by one. St. Loup wasn't always like that, Clara said, throwing a pebble into the water. When James was alive, people were friendly enough, but the moment I was alone, she trailed off, the memory still bitter. Fear makes people cruel, Rhett observed. They look at a widow with children and see their own vulnerability reflected back. Easier to turn away than acknowledge how thin the line is between security and destitution. You sound like you've thought about this before. Watched my father get turned away from enough doors to learn the pattern. Clara pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Did you ever get angry? Want to burn it all down? Every day for about 3 years? Rhett's voice was steady, matter of fact. Then I realized anger was just another kind of prison. Started looking for ways to make things different instead of dwelling on how wrong they were. Is that why you stopped for me? To make things different? Partly. Mostly, I just couldn't ride past. The simplicity of it struck Clara hard. He couldn't ride past. Couldn't see suffering and pretend he didn't. It was the kind of basic human decency that should have been common, but felt rare as diamonds. By midday, the heat had grown oppressive, and they returned to the bunkhouse. Rhett showed Clara how to adjust the stove damper for maximum efficiency, where to store food so mice wouldn't get to it, how to light the lamps safely. I need to get back to the main ranch, he said finally, settling his hat back on his head. Got afternoon work waiting, but I'll come by tomorrow, bring those tools I mentioned. Clara walked him to his horse, the children trailing behind. Mr. Carver, Rhett, I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness. Rhett swung into the saddle with easy grace, looking down at her with an expression that was somehow both serious and gentle. You don't repay kindness, Mrs. Holt. You pass it forward when you're able. That's how it works. He tipped his hat to the children. You 3 take care of your mama, all right? She's tougher than she looks, but everybody needs help sometimes. We will, Samuel promised enthusiastically. Even Thomas nodded, his small face solemn with the weight of responsibility. Clara watched Rhett ride away until he disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned to face her new home, this rough, weather-beaten bunkhouse that somehow felt more secure than anywhere she'd lived since James died. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of work and possibility. Clara set the children to gathering kindling while she began the process of truly settling in. She swept the floors, scrubbed the table, organized the supplies into some semblance of order. Every movement felt purposeful, necessary, building toward something real. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Clara stood in the doorway watching her children play in the yard. Eliza had found an old rope and was teaching her brothers to jump over it. They were filthy, sweaty, and completely absorbed in their game. They looked, Clara realized with a start, happy. When had that happened? When had the fear faded from their eyes, replaced by this tentative, fragile contentment? That night, after another simple supper, and after tucking exhausted children into bed, Clara sat on the porch steps and let herself think about Rhett Carver. Not in any romantic sense, she was too raw, too recent a widow for that, but with a kind of wondering curiosity. What made a man stop for strangers? What made him give without counting the cost? And why did his steadiness feel less like charity and more like partnership? She didn't have answers to those questions, but as she sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, Clara felt something shift inside her. The crushing weight of despair that had been her constant companion for months seemed lighter somehow. Not gone, but bearable. She'd survived another day. Her children were safe. And tomorrow, she'd begin the work of building something more than mere survival. It wasn't hope, not yet. Hope felt too fragile, too dangerous to hold. But it was possibility, and that was enough. True to his word, Rhett returned the next morning with a collection of tools: a hoe, a rake, a spade, a hammer, and a box of assorted nails. He also brought a wooden crate filled with vegetable seeds: tomatoes, beans, squash, even some herbs Clara didn't recognize. Mrs. Price saved these from last season, he explained, setting the crate on the porch. Said she had more than she needed and you'd probably get better use from them. Clara lifted one of the seed packets, turning it over in her hands. I've never met Mrs. Price. No, but I told her about you. She wanted to help. Does everyone at the Price Ranch go around rescuing strangers? Rhett smiled, a rare, full expression that transformed his face. Just the ones who learned what it's like to need rescuing. Over the following days, a rhythm began to establish itself. Rhett came by every morning, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to check in. He'd spend an hour or two helping with the heavier work, reinforcing the porch, patching holes in the roof, clearing brush from around the foundation. Then he'd head to the main ranch for his regular duties, leaving Clara to manage the endless smaller tasks that turned a shelter into a home. Clara attacked the garden with a determination that bordered on ferocity. She worked the soil until her hands bled, pulling weeds, turning earth, creating neat rows for planting. The physical labor was exhausting, but it was also cathartic, something she could control, something she could shape with her own hands. The children helped where they could. Eliza proved surprisingly adept at identifying weeds versus intentional plants. Samuel's enthusiasm exceeded his usefulness, but Clara appreciated his effort. Even Thomas contributed, carrying small stones to mark the garden borders, his chubby hands working with intense concentration. On the fourth day, Rhett brought his lunch with him and ate with them on the porch. Clara had made a simple stew from dried beans and salt pork, stretching it with wild onions she'd found growing near the creek. It wasn't much, but it was hot and filling, and everyone ate with good appetite. Garden's coming along, Rhett observed, gesturing toward the plot where neat rows were beginning to emerge from the chaos. It'll be better once things actually start growing, Clara said. Right now it's just potential. Potential's important. Can't harvest what you don't plant. Samuel, emboldened by days of Rhett's patient attention, climbed onto the step beside the cowboy. Will you teach me to ride a horse? Samuel, Clara interjected, don't bother Mr. Carver with... I don't mind, Rhett said easily, but you'll need to ask your mama first. It's her decision. Samuel turned pleading eyes to Clara. Please, Mama, I'll be real careful. Clara hesitated. The thought of her son on horseback terrified her. One more thing that could go wrong, one more way she could lose someone she loved. But she also saw the hope in his face, the way he looked at Rhett with something approaching worship. "Maybe when you're a bit older," she said finally, trying to soften the refusal. Samuel's face fell, but he didn't argue. Rhett caught Clara's eye and gave a small nod of understanding. "They'd talk about it later," the gesture said. "No pressure, no judgment." After lunch, Rhett spent time with the children while Clara washed dishes. She watched through the window as he showed them how to braid a rope, his large hands moving slowly so they could follow along. His patience was remarkable. He never got frustrated when Samuel dropped the strands for the 5th time, never made Eliza feel foolish for asking to be shown again. "He's good with them," Clara said that evening after Rhett had gone and the children were in bed. She was talking to herself, but saying it out loud made it feel more real. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that felt almost like normalcy. Clara worked the garden until it transformed from rough earth to organized rows of emerging green. She repaired tiers and clothing, scrubbed floors, learned to make a dozen different meals from their limited supplies. The children grew stronger, their faces filling out, their laughter becoming more frequent and less startled. And Rhett kept coming back. Sometimes he brought things, coffee, sugar, a chicken he'd traded for, though Clara suspected he'd simply bought it. Sometimes he brought nothing but his presence, working alongside her in comfortable silence, asking for nothing beyond the chance to help. Clara found herself watching for him in the mornings, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that meant she wouldn't face the day alone. It wasn't dependence, she told herself. It was just appreciation for reliable help. But late at night, when the children were asleep and the prairie stretched dark and infinite around her, Clara admitted to herself that it was becoming something more than appreciation. Rhett's steady presence had become a fixed point in her world, something she oriented herself around without quite meaning to. One evening, about 3 weeks after they'd arrived, Clara stood in the garden watching the first tomato plant break through the soil. It was a tiny green shoot, fragile and determined, pushing its way toward the sun. She thought about seeds and potential, about the difference between surviving and growing. She thought about Rhett's quiet insistence that she deserved help, that accepting kindness wasn't weakness. And for the first time since James died, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next meal, the next day, the next crisis. She let herself imagine roots going down, leaves reaching up, something green and alive emerging from the dust. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was still standing there when she heard familiar hoofbeats approaching. Rhett appeared from the direction of the main ranch, his horse moving slowly in the fading light. "Bit late for a visit," Clara called out, surprised. Rhett dismounted, and even in the dimness she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Had a thought I wanted to share before I lost my nerve." Clara's pulse quickened. What kind of thought? Rhett removed his hat, turning it in his hands, the first nervous gesture she'd ever seen from him. "There's a gathering at the main ranch this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just neighbors and ranch hands, some music and food. Mrs. Price asked me to invite you and the children." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She wasn't ready for crowds, for questions, for the inevitable judgment of strangers. But before she could speak, Rhett continued, "I know it's probably too much too soon, and I know you've got reason to be wary of folks, but the children might enjoy it. And Mrs. Price, she's good people, Mrs. Holt. She doesn't help out of obligation. She helps because she wants to." Clara studied his face, seeing the sincerity there, the careful hope. "Would you be there?" "Yes, ma'am. Wouldn't invite you somewhere I wasn't going to be." That decided it. Clara nodded slowly. "We'll come. But if it's too much, if the children get overwhelmed, then we leave. No questions asked." Clara smiled, something warm unfurling in her chest. "All right then. We'll come to your gathering." Rhett's relief was palpable. "Good, that's real good." He lingered a moment longer, like there was something else he wanted to say. But the moment passed, and he mounted his horse with a quiet "good night" that Clara returned, watching him disappear into the darkness. She stood in the garden until full night had fallen, until the stars emerged in their thousands, until the air cooled enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. And somewhere in that darkness, Clara felt the last of her resistance beginning to crumble. She wasn't saved, wasn't healed, but she was here, standing in soil she'd worked with her own hands, anticipating a future that extended beyond simple survival. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Saturday arrived with a clarity of sky that felt almost mocking in its perfection. Clara stood in front of the small mirror she'd hung near the window, studying her reflection with the critical eye of a woman who hadn't cared about her appearance in months. Her dress was clean but worn, patched at the elbows and faded from too many washings. Her hair, dark and thick, hung in a simple braid down her back because she'd long since lost the pins that might have arranged it into something more presentable. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she was. A woman who'd been surviving rather than living. "Mama, you look pretty," Eliza said from behind her, and Clara turned to find all three children dressed in their best clothes, which weren't much better than her own. Samuel's pants were too short, showing an inch of ankle. Thomas's shirt had a stain on the collar that wouldn't come out no matter how hard Clara scrubbed. Eliza's dress, handed down from a cousin years ago, pulled tight across the shoulders. They looked poor. There was no way around it, and Clara felt the old familiar shame rising in her throat, threatening to choke her. "Maybe we shouldn't go," she said quietly. "Maybe this was a mistake." "But Mr. Rhett invited us," Samuel protested. "He said there'd be music and food and other kids to play with." Clara looked at her son's eager face, at the disappointment already forming in his eyes, and felt something harden in her resolve. She'd spent too many years letting shame dictate her choices. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. "You're right," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Mr. Rhett invited us, and we said we'd come. So, we'll go." They walked the mile to the main ranch compound, following the rutted road that wound through prairie grass turned golden by the summer sun. Clara carried Thomas when his small legs grew tired, while Eliza and Samuel ran ahead, chasing butterflies and arguing about whether the clouds looked more like horses or dragons. The Price Ranch emerged gradually from the landscape, first the windmill, then the barn, then the main house itself, a sprawling structure of wood and stone that spoke of prosperity earned through decades of hard work. Behind it spread corrals and outbuildings, and beyond those the vast expanse of grazing land that had made the Price family one of the most successful in the territory. Clara's steps slowed as they approached. She could already hear music drifting on the air, the sound of fiddles and laughter, the kind of communal joy that felt foreign to her now. Her instinct was to turn around, to retreat to the safety of the bunkhouse where no one could see how far she'd fallen. But then she saw Rhett, standing near the barn, scanning the horizon like he'd been watching for them. When his eyes found her, his whole face softened with relief. He walked toward them with that easy, unhurried stride, and Clara felt some of her anxiety ease. As long as Rhett was there, she told herself, it would be all right. "Mrs. Holt," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Children, glad you made it." "We almost didn't," Clara admitted, then immediately regretted the honesty. But Rhett just nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know these things can be overwhelming, but I'll stay close, all right? And the moment you want to leave, we leave." The children had already spotted other kids their age running around near the barn, and Samuel was practically vibrating with the desire to join them. Claire released them with a quiet warning to stay where she could see them, and they took off like wild things suddenly freed from captivity. "Come on," Rhett said gently. "I want you to meet Mrs. Price." He led her toward a group of women standing near long tables laden with food. Clara's stomach clenched at the sight of so much abundance. Roasted chickens, fresh bread, pies, vegetables she couldn't even name. It was obscene, this plenty, when she'd spent months rationing every scrap. "Margaret," Rhett called, and one of the women turned. Mrs. Price was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that held the kind of sharpness that came from running a household and a business. She wore a simple dress that probably cost more than everything Clara owned, but there was nothing pretentious in her bearing. "You must be Clara Holt," she said, offering her hand. Not a delicate handshake, but a firm grip that spoke of a woman used to real work. "Rhett's told me so much about you." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I hope not too much. Only that you're working harder than any 3 people to make that old bunkhouse livable again." Mrs. Price smiled warmly. "And that you've got 3 beautiful children who've been through more than they should have to." "They're resilient," Clara said, defaulting to the easiest response. "I imagine they learned that from their mother." Mrs. Price gestured to the tables. "Please, help yourself to food. There's far too much here, and it'll just go to waste otherwise." Clara hesitated, and Mrs. Price seemed to read her discomfort perfectly. Rhett, why don't you fix Clara a plate while I steal her away for a moment? There's something I want to show her. Before Clara could protest, Mrs. Price had linked their arms and was walking her toward the main house. Clara glanced back at Rhett, who gave her an encouraging nod. I know what you're thinking, Mrs. Price said quietly as they walked. You're thinking this is charity dressed up as kindness. You're thinking I'm about to make you feel small and grateful and indebted. Clara couldn't deny it, so she said nothing. Mrs. Price stopped at the porch steps, turning to face her directly. My husband's mother was widowed young, with 3 children and no prospects. She survived by accepting help from people who didn't ask for anything in return, except that she do the same for someone else when she was able. That's how my husband was raised. To understand that community isn't about keeping score. It's about recognizing that we all need help sometimes, and we're all capable of giving it. I'm not good at accepting help, Clara admitted. Neither was I. When my eldest daughter nearly died of scarlet fever, and half the territory showed up to help nurse her through it. Accepting help is harder than giving it, I think. It requires a different kind of strength. Clara looked at this woman who'd never known hunger, who'd never stood in the dust wondering if death would be easier than survival, and tried not to resent her wisdom. It wasn't Mrs. Price's fault that her life had been easier, and there was genuine kindness in her eyes, not pity. Rhett speaks very highly of you, Clara said, changing the subject. Rhett's loyalty runs deep. Once you've earned his respect, you've got it for life. Mrs. Price studied Clara's face carefully. He doesn't bring people around often. You must be special. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she looked away, watching the children play in the distance. Thomas had found a stick and was drawing patterns in the dirt, while other children showed him their treasures, rocks, feathers, bits of colored glass. He's a good man, Mrs. Price continued. Lost his way a bit after his father died, angry at the world and everyone in it. But he found his footing here, learned that the best revenge against cruelty is kindness. Now he's one of the finest men I've ever known. Why are you telling me this? Because I see the way he looks at you, and the way you're trying very hard not to look at him. Mrs. Price squeezed Clara's arm gently. I'm not suggesting anything improper. You're recently widowed, and no one expects you to be thinking about such things. But someday, when you're ready, I hope you'll remember that good men are rare, and Rhett Carver is one of the best. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes and blinked them back furiously. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for anything like that again. That's all right. There's no timeline for healing. But don't close yourself off completely, Clara. Sometimes the person who helps you survive can also help you live. They returned to find Rhett waiting with 2 plates piled high with food. Clara took hers mechanically, overwhelmed by the generosity and the weight of expectations she hadn't asked for. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of introductions and conversations. Clara met ranch hands with weather-beaten faces and wives who traded recipes and advice with easy familiarity. Some were curious about her, asking careful questions about where she'd come from and what had brought her to the bunkhouse. Others were refreshingly indifferent, treating her like she'd always been part of the community. Through it all, Rhett stayed close, not hovering but present, ready to redirect uncomfortable questions or simply provide a familiar face in a sea of strangers. As evening approached and the music grew louder, Clara found herself sitting on a hay bale near the barn, watching Eliza dance with the other children while Samuel and Thomas chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Her plate sat beside her, barely touched despite the food being the best she'd tasted in months. You doing all right? Rhett appeared beside her, settling onto the hay bale with the kind of ease that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before. I'm overwhelmed, Clara admitted. But in a good way, I think. These folks can be a lot all at once, but they mean well. Mrs. Price told me about your father, about how her family helped you. Rhett nodded slowly, his eyes on the dancing children. Changed my life, that kindness. Made me understand that the world wasn't as cruel as I'd convinced myself it was. Was it hard? Accepting their help? Hardest thing I'd ever done at the time. Felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging I couldn't make it on my own. He paused, then added quietly, but turns out nobody makes it completely on their own. We're all just stumbling through, helping each other when we can. Clara watched Eliza spin in circles, her face glowing with joy, and felt something crack open in her chest. I was ready to give up, she heard herself say, that day you found us. I was ready to just lie down in that dust and let the world move on without me. Rhett was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I'm real glad you didn't. So am I. Clara turned to look at him directly, needing him to understand. You saved us, Rhett. Not just our lives, but something more important than that. You gave us a reason to keep trying. You kept going anyway, Rhett said, echoing his words from that first day. I just provided a place to land. You provided more than that. You provided dignity. You let me work for what we needed instead of just taking charity. You let me feel useful again. Rhett shifted uncomfortably, like praise made him uneasy. Just seemed like the right thing to do. For you, maybe, but most people don't do the right thing when it costs them something. Most people look away. Then most people are missing out on knowing someone as strong as you. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning Clara wasn't quite ready to examine. She looked away, focusing on the music, the laughter, the easy camaraderie of people who belonged somewhere. Can I tell you something? Rhett said after a while. Of course. He took a breath, like he was gathering courage. That first day when I saw you standing there in the heat with those children, I saw my mother. She had that same look in her eyes, like she was holding on by sheer force of will, refusing to break, even though breaking would have been easier. Clara felt her throat tighten. My mother kept us alive for 3 years after my father lost his first job. 3 years of moving from place to place, working whatever job she could find, never complaining, never showing us how scared she was. And then one day she just collapsed. Her body gave out because she'd been giving everything to us and keeping nothing for herself. Rhett, I'm sorry. I saw that same exhaustion in you, he continued, his voice steady despite the pain Clara could hear beneath it. That same determination to keep going past the point where your body was begging you to stop. And I thought maybe if I could help you, maybe I could give you what someone should have given my mother, a chance to rest, a chance to rebuild strength instead of just spending it. Clara reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact with him, and she felt him startle slightly before his fingers curled around hers. Your mother would be proud of the man you became, she said softly. I hope so. I try to honor her memory by being the kind of person who stops instead of riding past. They sat like that for a while, hands linked, watching the celebration unfold around them. Clara felt the warmth of his palm against hers, the calluses that spoke of hard work, the steadiness that had become her anchor in these weeks of rebuilding. Mama! Samuel came running up, breathless with excitement. Mr. Rhett, one of the hands said he'd show us the horses. Can we go see? Rhett stood, reluctantly releasing Clara's hand. Lead the way, partner. Clara watched them go, her son practically bouncing with enthusiasm, Rhett matching his pace with patient attention. The sight of them together did something to her heart, something that felt dangerous and wonderful in equal measure. He's good with them. Clara turned to find Mrs. Price standing nearby, a knowing smile on her face. He is, Clara agreed carefully, and you're good for him. I haven't seen him this settled in years. Mrs. Price sat down beside her, sighing contentedly. He's been adrift since his father died, throwing himself into work and helping others but never really finding peace. But these last few weeks since you arrived, there's been a change in him, a lightness. I think you're reading too much into simple kindness. Maybe. Or maybe I've known that boy for 12 years and I recognize what hope looks like on his face. Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she let the words settle between them, neither confirming nor denying what Mrs. Price was suggesting. As full darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting warm pools of light that pushed back the night. Someone started playing a slow waltz on the fiddle, and couples began to dance, ranch hands with their wives, neighbors who'd known each other for decades, even Mrs. Price with her husband, a tall man with kind eyes who'd greeted Clara with genuine warmth earlier in the evening. Rhett returned with the children, all of them talking excitedly about the horses they'd seen, the foal that had been born just last week, the black stallion that only Mr. Price could ride. Thomas climbed into Clara's lap, exhausted from the day's excitement, and nestled his head against her chest. She held him close, breathing in the scent of dust and sweat and pure childhood joy. "Dance with me." Clara looked up, startled, to find Rhett standing in front of her, his hand extended. I haven't danced since—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Rhett said gently, "but I'm asking anyway. Just one dance, and if it's too much, we'll stop." Clara glanced at Mrs. Price, who'd somehow materialized to take Thomas from her arms. "Go on," the older woman said. "I'll watch the children." Every instinct told Clara to refuse. Dancing felt too intimate, too much like moving forward when she still felt mired in the past. But Rhett's hand was still extended, patient and steady, and she found herself placing her hand in his almost against her will. He led her to the edge of the dancing area, where the lantern light was softer, less exposed. When he placed his hand on her waist, Clara felt every nerve in her body come alive with awareness. "Just follow my lead," Rhett murmured. "I'll keep it simple." They began to move, and Clara was surprised to find that her body remembered how to do this, even after years of dancing only in the privacy of her own kitchen with James. Rhett was a capable dancer, nothing fancy but solid and reliable, guiding her through the steps with quiet confidence. "You're trembling," he observed softly. "I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "Of dancing? Of everything this represents, of feeling something other than grief, of letting someone close again." Rhett's hand tightened slightly on her waist, not constraining, just grounding. "You don't have to feel anything you're not ready for, Clara. This is just a dance. Nothing more unless you want it to be." But it wasn't just a dance, and they both knew it. It was Clara allowing herself to be held, to be led, to trust someone else's strength for a few precious minutes. It was her acknowledging that maybe, possibly, she didn't want to walk alone for the rest of her life. "When I first saw you," Rhett said quietly, his breath warm against her ear, "I didn't see someone broken. I saw someone tired of walking alone. There's a difference." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "I was so tired, Rhett. I'm still tired." "I know, but you're still walking, still fighting. That's strength, Clara, not weakness." The music swelled around them, and for a moment Clara let herself simply exist in this space, held by someone who asked nothing of her except that she keep breathing, keep trying, keep believing that tomorrow might be easier than today. When the song ended, they stood still for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then Rhett stepped back, releasing her with visible reluctance. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Anytime you need someone to walk beside you, I'm here," he replied. "Not ahead, not behind, beside you." They returned to where Mrs. Price sat with the children, all three of whom were fighting sleep and losing. Clara gathered them up, making apologies about the long walk home in the dark. "Nonsense," Mr. Price said, speaking for the first time since their introduction. "Rhett can drive you in the wagon. No sense making those children walk after the day they've had." Clara started to protest, but Rhett was already moving toward the barn. 10 minutes later, he'd hitched up a wagon and helped load the sleepy children into the back, where they immediately curled up against each other like puppies. The ride back to the bunkhouse was quiet, filled with the sounds of the wagon wheels creaking and the night insects singing their endless songs. Clara sat beside Rhett on the bench, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not quite touching. "Thank you for today," she said finally, "for inviting us, for staying close, for making it bearable." "It was my pleasure." "Was it?" Clara turned to look at him in the moonlight. "I saw you giving up your own evening to babysit a nervous widow and her children. That can't have been what you wanted to do." Rhett met her eyes directly. "Clara, there's nowhere I'd rather have been." The sincerity in his voice undid something in her chest. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze, afraid of what he might see in her face. When they reached the bunkhouse, Rhett carried each sleeping child inside and laid them gently on their cots. Clara covered them with blankets, kissing each forehead, marveling at how peaceful they looked after a day of uncomplicated joy. She walked Rhett back to the wagon, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Will you come by tomorrow?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for asking. "I'd planned on it. Need to check that fence section near the creek. But I can stay away if you need space after today." "No," Clara said quickly. "Don't stay away, please." Rhett smiled, a slow expression that transformed his usually serious face. All right then. I'll see you in the morning. He climbed into the wagon, then paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Clara? Yes? You're not alone anymore. I need you to know that. Whatever happens, wherever this goes, you're not walking alone. Before she could respond, he snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, carrying him back toward the main ranch and leaving Clara standing in the moonlight with her heart pounding. She stood there long after the wagon disappeared, long after the sound of wheels faded into silence. Above her, stars blazed in their thousands, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called its hunting song. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat strong and steady beneath her palm. She was alive. Her children were safe. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the stirrings of something beyond mere survival. She felt hope. Fragile and terrifying, yes, but unmistakably hope. That night, lying in her narrow cot with the children breathing softly nearby, Clara allowed herself to think about Rhett without immediately shutting down the thoughts. She remembered the feel of his hand on her waist as they danced, the steadiness in his voice when he told her she wasn't broken, the way he looked at her children with genuine affection rather than obligation. She thought about James, about the love they'd shared, about the life they'd built together, and she wondered if it was possible to honor that love while still opening herself to the possibility of something new. Not now. She wasn't ready now. Maybe she'd never be ready, but someday, possibly, if she could find the courage, maybe she'd allow herself to stop walking and start building again, with someone beside her instead of behind her, with someone who saw her strength instead of her weakness, with someone who'd looked at her in her worst moment and decided she was worth stopping for. Clara fell asleep with those thoughts drifting through her mind, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of James dying in the rain. Instead, she dreamed of green things growing, of walls being raised, of a foundation solid enough to build a life on. And when she woke the next morning to the sound of familiar hoofbeats approaching, Clara found herself smiling before she'd even opened her eyes. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The days that followed the gathering fell into a rhythm that felt less like routine and more like the careful construction of something permanent. Clara woke each morning to birdsong and the growing certainty that she was building a life rather than merely surviving one. The garden flourished under her attention, green shoots pushing through the soil with a determination that mirrored her own. Tomato plants climbed their stakes, bean vines twisted around supports Rhett had built, and squash leaves spread wide and generous across their designated rows. Rhett's visits became as reliable as the sunrise, though the nature of them had shifted in ways Clara couldn't quite name. There was a carefulness between them now, a heightened awareness that manifested in accidental touches that lasted a moment too long, in glances that carried weight beyond their apparent casualness. He still came to help with repairs and heavy work, but increasingly he came simply to be there, to share coffee on the porch or walk the fence line while they talked about nothing and everything. The children had stopped treating his presence as remarkable. Samuel now ran to greet him the moment he appeared, chattering about whatever had captured his attention that day. Eliza showed him her drawings, crude sketches of horses and houses that she made with charcoal on pieces of scrap wood. Even Thomas, still too young to fully understand who Rhett was, would toddle over and raise his arms to be lifted, secure in the knowledge that this man would never refuse him. Clara watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and growing concern. Her children were attaching themselves to Rhett, weaving him into the fabric of their daily lives, and she didn't know if she had the right to allow it. What would happen when he moved on? When he found a woman his own age, someone without the baggage of 3 children and a dead husband's ghost? Would her children's hearts break all over again? But then she'd catch Rhett's eye over Samuel's head as the boy described some elaborate game he'd invented, and the gentleness in his expression would undo all her careful reservations. He wasn't just tolerating her children. He genuinely cared for them. One morning, about 6 weeks after they'd arrived, Clara was hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between 2 posts when Rhett appeared earlier than usual. Something in his posture told her this wasn't a typical visit. "Morning," she called, pinning one of Samuel's shirts in place. "You're early. Rhett dismounted, but instead of his usual easy greeting, he stood holding his horse's reins, his hat in his other hand. Had something I wanted to talk to you about before I lost my nerve. Clara's stomach tightened. Here it was then. The moment he'd tell her he'd met someone, or that he was leaving, or that his kindness had reached its natural conclusion. She forced herself to keep hanging laundry, to keep her hands busy so he wouldn't see them shake. What is it? Rhett walked closer, stopping a few feet away. There's a piece of land, about 3 miles east of here, right along the river bend. 20 acres, good soil, water access year-round. It's been sitting empty for years because the original owner died without heirs and the bank's been trying to sell it. Clara hung another shirt, not understanding where this was going. Okay. I've been saving money for near about 8 years now, living simple, not spending much, just putting away what I could. Had this idea that someday I'd buy a piece of land, build something of my own instead of just working someone else's property. Clara's hands stilled on the laundry. That sounds like a good plan. I went to the bank yesterday, made an offer on that land along the river. Rhett turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. They accepted. Rhett, that's wonderful. Clara turned to face him fully, genuine happiness pushing aside her own anxiety. You'll have your own place, your own— I want you to see it, he interrupted. Before I start building, before I make any decisions about what it should be, I want you to see it and tell me what you think. Clara blinked, confused. Why does my opinion matter? Rhett met her eyes directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Because I'm not building a bachelor's cabin, Clara. I'm building a home, and I'm hoping— He stopped, swallowed hard, then continued. I'm hoping it might be your home too, yours and the children's. The laundry basket slipped from Clara's hands, hitting the ground with a soft thud. She stared at him, unable to process what he was saying, unable to reconcile his words with the careful distance she'd been maintaining between them. I don't understand, she whispered. I'm saying I want to build a life with you. Rhett took a step closer, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving your husband, and I'm not asking you to stop. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel. Rhett, let me finish, he said gently. I've spent the last 6 weeks watching you turn that rundown bunkhouse into a home, watching you coax life out of dead soil, watching you love those children with a fierceness that humbles me. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as someone who needed help and started seeing you as someone I wanted to build a future with. Clara's eyes burned with tears. You barely know me. I know you're strong enough to keep walking when most people would have laid down and died. I know you're proud enough to work for what you need instead of just taking charity. I know you love your children more than your own life, and that you're terrified of letting anyone close because you can't survive losing someone again. The accuracy of his observation hit Clara like a physical blow. Then you understand why I can't— I'm not asking you to love me, Rhett said quietly. Not yet, maybe not ever. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something together, a partnership, a home for you and the children, a place where you don't have to carry everything alone. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together against the wave of emotion threatening to sweep her away. What if I can't be what you need? What if I'm too broken, too damaged by everything that's happened? Then we'll be broken together. Rhett finally closed the distance between them, standing close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. Clara, I'm not some knight riding in to save you. I'm just a man who's tired of being alone, who sees a woman strong enough to match him step for step. I'm offering partnership, not rescue. The children love me already, I think. And I love them, not because they're part of some package deal, but because they're funny and brave and resilient, just like their mother. Clara looked past him toward the bunkhouse, where she could hear Samuel and Eliza arguing about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Thomas's lighter voice joined in, though he probably didn't even understand what they were fighting about. These were her babies, her responsibility, her reason for breathing. What if you change your mind? She asked, her voice breaking. What if you wake up one day and realize you've tied yourself to a widow with 3 children and a mountain of grief? What if I don't? Rhett countered. What if this is exactly what I want? What if I've been waiting my whole life for someone like you? You can't possibly know that. Maybe not with certainty, but I know what I feel when I wake up in the morning and realize I get to see you today. I know how right it feels to sit on your porch and watch your children play. I know that when I think about my future, you're in it, all of you. Clara turned away, pressing her hands to her face. This was too much, too fast, too overwhelming after months of barely holding herself together. How could he ask this of her? How could he expect her to have the courage to risk her heart again? I need to think, she managed. Take all the time you need, Rhett said. But will you at least come see the land? Let me show you what I'm imagining. Clara lowered her hands, wiping at her tears. When? Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, next week, next month. I'll wait. She looked at him standing there, patient and steady, offering her the world while asking for nothing in return. And she thought about what Mrs. Price had said at the gathering about good men being rare and Rhett being one of the best. Tomorrow, Clara heard herself say. Show me tomorrow. Rhett's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. Tomorrow, then. I'll come by after breakfast. He left shortly after, and Clara stood alone in the yard, staring at the laundry she'd forgotten to finish hanging. Her mind spun with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Could she really do this? Could she open her heart to someone new when James's memory still lived in every breath she took? That evening, after the children were in bed, Clara sat on the porch and forced herself to think about her husband. Really think about him. Not just the idealized version she'd been clinging to, but the real man she'd loved and lost. James had been kind, but not particularly ambitious. Content with their small plot of land, their simple life, their quiet existence on the edges of other people's prosperity. He'd loved her in his way, steady and reliable, but there'd never been passion there, never the sense that she was his entire world rather than just a comfortable part of it. She'd been happy with him, content, safe. But had she ever felt truly seen? Had James ever looked at her the way Rhett did, like she was something rare and precious? Had he ever offered her partnership instead of protection? The comparison felt disloyal, but Clara forced herself to sit with it. James deserved her honesty, even in memory. And the truth was that what Rhett was offering felt different from what she'd had before. Not better or worse, just different, more equal, more real. Mama? Clara turned to find Eliza standing in the doorway, her nightgown glowing pale in the moonlight. Sweetheart, you should be asleep. I heard Mr. Rhett talking today, when you were outside. Eliza came and sat beside her mother, her small hand finding Clara's. He wants us to live with him, doesn't he? Clara's first instinct was to deflect, but she'd never lied to her children and she wasn't about to start. He wants to build a house, and yes, he asked if we might want to live there. Would we have to leave here? Eventually, maybe, but not right away, and only if it's what we all want. Eliza was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I like Mr. Rhett. He's nice to us. He is nice to us. Samuel says Mr. Rhett could be our new papa. Eliza looked up at her mother, her expression serious beyond her 7 years. But we already had a papa. Clara pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair. We did. Your papa loved you very much, and nothing will ever change that. But he's gone. Yes, baby, he's gone. And Mr. Rhett is here. The simple logic of childhood cut through all of Clara's complex rationalizations. James was gone. Rhett was here. Both things were true, and maybe they didn't have to contradict each other. Would you be sad if we lived with Mr. Rhett? Clara asked carefully. Eliza considered this seriously. I'd be sad if we forgot Papa, but I don't think Mr. Rhett would make us forget. I think he'd let us remember and still be happy. Out of the mouths of babes, Clara thought. Her 7-year-old daughter had articulated what she'd been struggling to understand, that honoring the past and embracing the future weren't mutually exclusive. You're very wise, you know that? Eliza smiled, pleased with the compliment. Can I go back to bed now? Of course, sweetheart. Clara tucked her daughter in again, then lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a future that didn't feel like betrayal. By the time dawn broke, she hadn't reached any firm conclusions, but she felt less afraid of the questions. Rhett arrived the next morning with a borrowed wagon and a basket packed with lunch. The children were ecstatic about the adventure, piling into the back with excited chatter about seeing new places and maybe spotting wildlife along the way. The ride east took about 40 minutes, following a rutted path that wound through prairie grass and stands of cottonwood. The land here was lusher than around the bunkhouse, fed by the nearby river that Clara could hear but not yet see. "It's just over this rise," Rhett said, and Clara heard the barely contained excitement in his voice. They crested the hill, and Clara's breath caught. The land spread before them in a gentle slope down to the river, 20 acres of possibility bordered by water on one side and open prairie on the others. Trees clustered along the riverbank, their leaves rustling in the breeze. The soil looked dark and rich, the kind that would grow anything given half a chance. And the view stretched for miles, prairie and sky meeting in a line so perfect it looked painted. "Oh," Clara breathed. Rhett stopped the wagon, letting her take it in. "That flat area near the trees, that's where I was thinking to build. Close enough to the river for water access, far enough back that flooding won't be an issue. The land slope's natural for drainage, and those cottonwoods will provide shade in summer." The children had already jumped from the wagon and were racing toward the river, their delighted shouts carrying on the wind. Clara watched them go, then turned to really look at what Rhett was showing her. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "I thought so too." He helped her down from the wagon, and they walked together toward the building site he'd indicated. "Been coming here for years just to sit and think. Always figured if I ever had the money, this is where I'd plant roots." Clara stood on the flat ground, turning in a slow circle to take in the full scope of the land. She could imagine a house here, something solid and well-built, with windows that caught the morning light. Could imagine a garden, larger than what she had at the bunkhouse, with room for vegetables and maybe even flowers. Could imagine the children playing by the river, climbing the cottonwoods, growing up with space to breathe and explore. "What are you thinking?" Rhett asked quietly. Clara didn't know how to put into words the tangle of emotions churning in her chest. Fear and hope and longing and grief all mixed together until she couldn't separate one from another. "I'm thinking it's almost too good to be true," she admitted. "I'm thinking I've learned the hard way that beautiful things can be taken away in an instant. I'm thinking I don't know if I have the courage to hope for this." Rhett moved to stand beside her, close but not touching. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. Can't promise I'll live to be an old man or that disaster won't strike when we least expect it. But I can promise that whatever time we have, I'll spend it building something real with you, something solid enough to weather whatever comes." "Why me?" Clara turned to face him, needing to understand. "You could have anyone, someone younger, someone without all this baggage. Why choose a widow with 3 children and more grief than good sense?" "Because you're the strongest person I've ever met," Rhett said simply. "Because you kept walking when most people would have quit. Because you love with your whole heart even though it's been shattered. Because when I imagine my future, I can't see it without you in it." Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks again, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "I'm terrified." "So am I. I might never love you the way you deserve. That's a risk I'm willing to take. The children will always be yours first, and I'll never try to replace their father. But I'd like the chance to be someone steady in their lives, someone who shows up and doesn't leave." Clara looked past him at her children playing by the river, so carefree and alive, and something in her chest finally cracked open. Not breaking, but opening, letting in light and air and the possibility of something new. "I need time," she said. "I can't give you an answer today, standing here in this beautiful place with everything feeling possible. I need to sit with it, think about it, make sure I'm choosing this for the right reasons." "How much time?" "I don't know. Is that all right?" Rhett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so tender it made Clara's breath catch. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Rhett showed her where he planned to dig a well, where the house would sit to catch the best light, where a barn could go if they ever had livestock. He talked about the future with a certainty that was both inspiring and terrifying, painting pictures of a life Clara could almost let herself believe in. They ate lunch by the river, the children climbing trees and splashing in the shallows, while Clara and Rhett sat on a fallen log and shared bread and cheese and apples from the basket. "When would you start building?" Clara asked. Soon as I can get materials together, maybe a month or so. But I'd want input on the design, on how many rooms, where to put windows, all of it. Why would you want my input if you don't know if I'll even live there? Rhett looked at her steadily. Because even if you say no, I'll build it, hoping you'll change your mind. I'll build it with space for 3 children and a woman who deserves more than she's ever asked for. And if you never come, at least I'll have built something beautiful to remember you by. The declaration undid Clara completely. She turned away, pressing her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling this man was offering her. You barely know me, she whispered again, the same protest she'd made before. I know enough. And I've got the rest of our lives to learn the rest, if you'll let me, Samuel called out from the river, demanding they come see the frog he'd caught. And the moment broke. But as Clara walked toward her son, feeling Rhett's presence steady beside her, she felt something shift in her heart. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers today. Maybe it was enough to acknowledge that she was considering them, that the future Rhett was offering didn't feel impossible anymore, just improbable. On the ride back to the bunkhouse, the children fell asleep in the wagon bed, exhausted from their adventure. Clara sat beside Rhett in comfortable silence, watching the prairie roll past and thinking about roots and foundations and the courage it took to build something new. Can I ask you something? She said as the bunkhouse came into view. Always. If I say yes, and I'm not saying I am, but if I did, what would that look like? Would we marry right away? Would we... She couldn't quite bring herself to finish the question. Rhett seemed to understand what she was asking. We do whatever feels right to you. If you want to marry before we move to the new place, we marry. If you want to wait, live there as housekeeper or partner or whatever title makes you comfortable, we wait. And as for the rest, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I'd follow your lead. Marriage means different things to different people, and I'd want whatever physical aspect we had to be something you wanted, not something you felt obligated to provide. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she appreciated his directness. You're a patient man, Rhett Carver. I've waited 30 years to find someone worth building a life with. I can wait a bit longer to build it right. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat alone in the darkness of the bunkhouse and let herself imagine it. Really imagine it, without immediately shutting down the thoughts. She imagined waking in a house Rhett built, making breakfast while sunlight streamed through windows he'd positioned perfectly. Imagined her children running through rooms that were theirs, really theirs, not borrowed or temporary. Imagined growing old with someone who chose her not despite her scars, but including them. What do you think, James? She whispered to the darkness. Am I betraying you? Or am I finally living the way you'd want me to? She didn't expect an answer, but somewhere in the silence, Clara felt a release. As if the ghost she'd been carrying had finally given her permission to set him down gently and walk forward without him. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended state. Clara continued her work on the bunkhouse and garden, but her mind kept drifting to that land by the river, to the possibilities Rhett had laid before her. He continued his visits, but there was a new carefulness between them, an awareness that they were standing at a crossroads, and the direction they chose would determine everything that came after. Mrs. Price came to visit one afternoon, bringing preserves and fresh bread and the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from decades of living. Rhett told me about the land, she said without preamble, settling herself on the porch. Told me what he offered you. Clara felt defensive instincts rise. And you think I should refuse? That I'm not good enough for him? Heavens, no, child. I think you're exactly what he needs, and he's exactly what you need. I'm just checking to make sure you understand what you'd be getting. A home? Security? A father figure for my children? A partner, Mrs. Price corrected gently. Someone who'll stand beside you through every storm, who'll never make you feel less than his equal. Rhett's not like most men, Clara. He doesn't want a wife to cook and clean and bear his children, though he'd welcome all that. He wants a true partner, someone to build with and dream with and weather hard times with. Clara absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. I'm afraid I'll disappoint him, that I'm too damaged to be what he needs. We're all damaged, dear. The question isn't whether you're broken, it's whether you're willing to let someone help you heal, and more importantly, whether you're willing to help him heal too. Rhett needs healing? Mrs. Price smiled sadly. He spent 12 years working himself half to death trying to prove he's worth something, trying to make up for the poverty and loss of his childhood. He needs someone to tell him he's enough just as he is, someone to remind him that rest isn't weakness and accepting love isn't defeat. Clara hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered that Rhett might need her as much as she needed him. The idea shifted something in her perspective, made the partnership he was offering feel more balanced and less like charity. "What if I can't love him?" she asked quietly. "What if I'm too broken for that?" "Then you build something anyway," Mrs. Price said firmly. Love isn't the only foundation for a good marriage, though it helps. Respect, trust, shared purpose, those matter just as much. And sometimes love comes later, growing quiet and steady instead of burning bright right from the start. After Mrs. Price left, Clara stood in her garden and looked at what she'd accomplished in 6 weeks. Dead soil transformed into living abundance, broken fence lines repaired and reinforced, a structure that had been falling apart now weather-tight and functional. If she could do that with a garden and a building, what could she do with a life? With a future? With the careful partnership Rhett was offering? That evening, Samuel asked the question that had clearly been building in him for days. "Mama, are we going to live with Mr. Rhett?" Clara looked at her son, at the hope and fear warring in his young face, and realized she couldn't hide from this decision anymore. Her children deserved an answer. Rhett deserved an answer. And more importantly, she deserved to stop living in suspended animation and start actively choosing her future. "I don't know yet, baby," she said honestly, "but I'm thinking about it real hard." "I hope we do," Samuel said simply. "I like it when he's here. It feels safe." Safe. Such a simple word, such a profound need. Clara hadn't felt safe since James died, had been operating in a constant state of vigilance and fear. But when Rhett was around, that tension eased. She felt like she could breathe deeper, rest more fully, trust that someone else was watching for danger while she attended to the business of living. That night, Clara made her decision. She would say yes. Not because she was in love, though she suspected she was falling whether she wanted to admit it or not. Not because she needed rescue, though she'd certainly needed help, but because Rhett had offered her partnership, equality, a chance to build something real, and she'd be a fool to refuse it simply because she was afraid. Fear had governed her long enough. It was time to let something else guide her. Hope, maybe. Or trust. Or simple pragmatic recognition that good men were rare and Rhett Carver was one of the best. Tomorrow she'd tell him. Tomorrow she'd take the leap and trust that he'd be there to steady her if she stumbled. Tomorrow she'd choose to start building instead of just surviving. But tonight she sat on the porch and said goodbye to James one final time, thanking him for the love he'd given her and releasing him back to memory where he belonged. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the lens through which she viewed every possibility. Above her, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful nonetheless. And somewhere 3 miles east, Rhett probably sat on land he'd bought with hope in his heart, waiting for an answer he'd promised not to pressure her for. Clara smiled into the darkness, feeling lighter than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own fears and uncertainties, but it would also bring possibilities, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Morning came with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel possible. Clara woke before dawn, her decision sitting solid and certain in her chest, no longer a question but a quiet knowing. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the one she'd worn to the gathering, and braided her hair with hands that only trembled slightly. The children were still sleeping when she heard the hoofbeats. Right on time, as always. Rhett's reliability was one of the things she'd come to count on, the way the sun rose and set, the way seasons changed, predictable and steady. She met him at the door before he could knock, stepping onto the porch and closing it softly behind her. "Morning," he said, then stopped, taking in her appearance. "You're dressed up." "I have something to tell you," Clara said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "And I wanted to look like I meant it." Rhett's expression shifted from casual greeting to intense attention. He removed his hat slowly, holding it in both hands. "All right." Clara took a breath, then another, gathering the words she'd practiced in the dark hours before dawn. I've been thinking about what you offered, about the land, the house, the partnership, about what it would mean to say yes and what it would mean to say no. And I'm terrified, she admitted. I'm terrified of losing someone again, of building something beautiful and watching it burn down. I'm terrified I won't be enough, that I'm too damaged, too grief-stricken, too much of everything you don't need and not enough of what you do. Rhett started to speak, but she held up her hand. But I'm more terrified of living the rest of my life in fear, of teaching my children that the safe choice is to never risk your heart, never build anything, never hope for more than mere survival. Clara stepped closer to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his eyes catch the early light. So yes, Rhett Carver, yes, I'll build a life with you. Yes, I'll move to that land by the river and help you make it a home. Yes to partnership and possibility, and whatever future we can make together. The transformation in Rhett's face was something Clara knew she'd remember for the rest of her life. Pure joy, unguarded and complete, flooding through every feature until he looked like a man who'd just been handed the world. You mean it? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I mean it. Rhett closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and before Clara could process what was happening, he'd swept her up in his arms, lifting her feet clear off the porch. She let out a startled laugh, grabbing his shoulders for balance, and then he was spinning them both in a circle, holding her like she weighed nothing and mattered more than anything. When he finally set her down, they were both breathing hard, standing so close Clara could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hands lingered at her waist, steadying her, and she found herself not wanting him to let go. I'll build you the best house you've ever seen, Rhett promised, his voice fervent. Strong walls, good windows, room for the children to grow. I'll make it everything you need. I know you will. And I'll be patient, Clara, however long it takes for you to feel comfortable with all of this. With me, I'll wait. We'll go at your pace. Clara reached up without thinking, placing her palm against his cheek. The stubble there was rough beneath her hand, real and solid and present. I know that too. It's part of why I said yes. They stood like that for a long moment, the world narrowing to just the two of them, the morning light, the beginning of something neither could quite believe was real. Then the door banged open behind them and Samuel emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Mama, why are you hugging Mr. Rhett? Clara stepped back, feeling heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't let go of Rhett's hand. Because I have news, baby. News for all of you. The children gathered on the porch, Thomas still half asleep and clinging to Eliza's nightgown. Clara knelt so she was at their level, keeping one hand linked with Rhett's. You remember that beautiful land Mr. Rhett showed us by the river? 3 heads nodded in unison. Well, Mr. Rhett is going to build a house there, a real house with enough room for all of us. And if you'd like, that could be our new home. Samuel's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. Really? We'd live with Mr. Rhett? Yes, if that's what you want. I want that. Samuel threw himself at Rhett, who caught him easily, lifting the boy up. Does this mean you'll teach me to ride horses now? Samuel, Clara chided, but Rhett was laughing. We'll talk about horses later, partner. First, we've got a house to build. Eliza was watching Clara carefully, her 7-year-old face serious. What about Papa? Do we have to forget him? Clara's throat tightened, but she made herself answer honestly. No, sweetheart, we'll never forget your Papa. He'll always be part of our story, part of who you are. But he'd want us to be happy, to have a good life, to not stay stuck in sadness forever. And Mr. Rhett will take care of us? Mr. Rhett and I will take care of each other, Clara corrected gently. All of us together, like a family should. Eliza considered this, then nodded slowly. Okay. I think that's okay. Even Thomas seemed to sense the significance of the moment, reaching his chubby arms toward Rhett with a demand of up, up, that made everyone laugh. They spent the morning in a kind of euphoric planning session, the children throwing out increasingly absurd suggestions for the house, while Clara and Rhett tried to nail down actual practical details. By the time the sun was high and hot, they'd sketched a rough floor plan in the dirt of the yard, and Clara felt dizzy with the reality of what she'd agreed to. When do we start? She asked, as Rhett prepared to leave for his afternoon work at the main ranch. Materials should arrive within 2 weeks. Foundation work starts after that. Figure 3, maybe 4 months to get it livable if the weather holds. He paused, then added quietly, "We should probably talk about the other part too, the legal part." Clara's pulse quickened. "Marriage, you mean? If that's what you want? Or we could do it different, whatever makes you comfortable." Clara thought about the practical realities, about property rights and legitimacy, and what people would say if she moved in with a man she wasn't married to. "I think we should marry. Not right away, but before we move. Give people less to gossip about. Give the children a clear understanding of what we are to each other. Whatever you think is best." "You don't have an opinion on when you marry?" Rhett smiled, something soft and private. "My only opinion is that I want to marry you. The timing is yours to choose." Over the following weeks, Clara watched their future take shape in real time. Rhett worked dawn to dusk, splitting his time between his duties at the Price Ranch and the foundation he was laying by the river. Clara visited the site whenever she could, bringing lunch and watching with amazement as posts went into the ground, as lumber was shaped and fitted, as the abstract idea of a house became an actual physical structure. Mrs. Price helped Clara sew a new dress for the wedding, simple but beautiful in pale blue fabric that made Clara feel almost young again. The older woman's fingers were quick and sure as they worked, and her conversation ranged from practical advice about marriage to stories about her own early years with Mr. Price. "It wasn't all easy," she admitted, pinning a hem in place. "We fought terribly that first year, learning how to live with each other, learning that love doesn't mean you agree on everything. But we learned to fight fair, to never go to bed angry, to remember we were on the same side even when it didn't feel like it." "Were you in love with him when you married?" Clara asked. Mrs. Price smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "I was fond of him, respected him, liked him well enough. The love came later, growing slow and deep like tree roots. Some people get lightning strikes. I got something steadier, and I've never regretted it." The comparison gave Clara hope. She was fond of Rhett, certainly respected him, more than liked him if she was honest with herself. Maybe that was enough to build on. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late August, simple and quick in the parlor of the Price house, with only Mrs. Price, her husband, and a few ranch hands as witnesses. Clara wore her new blue dress and carried wildflowers the children had picked that morning. Rhett wore his best shirt, pressed and clean, his hair still damp from washing. When the moment came to speak their vows, Clara's voice wavered but held. She promised partnership and honesty, promised to build a life worth living, promised to honor what they were creating together. Rhett's voice was steady as stone, promising protection and provision, promising to stand beside her, not ahead of her, promising to love her children as if they were his own blood. The kiss was brief and chaste, appropriate for a room full of witnesses and 3 watching children. But in that moment of connection, Clara felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that she'd thought was sealed forever. Samuel cheered loud enough to make everyone laugh, and Thomas clapped his hands with glee even though he probably didn't understand what was happening. Only Eliza was quiet, her face thoughtful as she watched her mother become someone's wife again. Later, as they loaded the wagon for the trip back to the bunkhouse where they'd continue living until the new house was ready, Eliza pulled Clara aside. "Are you happy, Mama?" Clara knelt, taking her daughter's hands. "I am, sweetheart. Scared and happy at the same time. Is that okay?" "I think so. I'm scared and happy too." "What are you scared of?" Eliza bit her lip, clearly struggling with how to articulate complex feelings. "What if we forget who we used to be? What if we become different people and Papa wouldn't recognize us anymore?" Clara pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "We will become different people, baby. That's what growing means. But the parts that mattered to your Papa, the parts he loved, those will always be there. Our love for him doesn't disappear just because we love other people too. Promise?" "I promise." The house rose from the earth with startling speed once the foundation was set. Walls went up, a roof took shape, windows were fitted into frames that Rhett had measured 3 times to ensure perfection. Clara visited almost daily, watching the structure transform from skeleton to shelter, and each time she felt a growing sense of ownership that surprised her. This wasn't just Rhett's house. It was theirs, designed around their needs, their family, their future. Rhett had built a large common room with a kitchen at one end and space for a table big enough to seat them all. 3 smaller rooms branched off, one for the children to share, one for Clara and Rhett, and one that could serve as storage or a 4th bedroom if needed. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and well made, every board fitted with care, every nail driven true. One evening in early October, as the air finally began to cool from summer's heat, Rhett brought Clara to see the progress. The house was nearly complete now, just finishing work and furnishing left to do. "I wanted to show you something," he said, leading her to the room that would be theirs. The space was empty except for a bed frame he'd built himself, simple but beautiful in its craftsmanship. "It's lovely," Clara said honestly. "That's not what I wanted to show you." Rhett walked to the window, gesturing for her to join him. "Look." Clara crossed to stand beside him, and her breath caught. The window perfectly framed a view of the river and the cottonwoods beyond, the landscape painted in shades of gold and amber by the setting sun. "I positioned every window in this house deliberately," Rhett said quietly. "This one catches the sunrise. The kitchen window watches the garden plot I've already cleared. The children's room looks out on the yard where they'll play. But this one, our room, this one looks at the view that made me fall in love with this land in the first place." But Clara felt tears building behind her eyes. "You built this for us, really for us." "For you," Rhett corrected. "Everything I've done hoping you'd choose to stay." Clara turned to face him, this man who'd stopped when others rode past, who'd offered partnership instead of pity, who'd built her a home with windows positioned to catch the light just right. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Good." Rhett reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Because I've gotten used to having you around." "Just used to it?" Something shifted in his expression, humor giving way to intensity. "More than used to it. A lot more." Clara knew what he wasn't saying, could feel it in the tension between them, in the way his hand lingered near her face. He loved her. Maybe had loved her since that first day when he'd found her standing in the dust with nowhere left to go. But he wouldn't say it, wouldn't pressure her with declarations she might not be ready to return. "Rhett," she started, then paused, not sure what she wanted to say. "You don't have to—" "Let me finish," Clara interrupted gently. She took his hand, holding it between both of hers. "I'm not good at this, at feelings and declarations and all the things that supposedly come naturally. But I need you to know that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether you'll come by that day. I need you to know that when you're not around, the world feels less steady. And I need you to know that sometimes when I look at you, I feel something I was sure I'd never feel again." "What's that?" Rhett's voice was barely above a whisper. "Hope. Joy. The possibility of something beyond just surviving." Clara swallowed hard. "I think that might be love, or at least the beginning of it." Rhett's eyes closed briefly, like he was absorbing something too powerful to process while looking at her. When he opened them again, they were suspiciously bright. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "Really kiss you, not like at the wedding?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Yes." He moved slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Clara didn't want to change her mind. When his lips met hers, she felt the last of her carefully maintained walls crumble. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, 2 people learning the language of each other. But then Clara's hands found their way to his shoulders, and Rhett's arms wrapped around her waist, and suddenly gentle wasn't enough. This kiss spoke of months of tension and attraction carefully denied, of want and need, and the relief of finally admitting what had been growing between them all along. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara felt dizzy with the intensity of it. "I love you," Rhett said, the words tumbling out like he couldn't hold them back another second. "I've loved you since you stood there covered in dust and refused to take my help until I made it about work instead of charity. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you love those children more than your own life. I love you, Clara, and I'll keep loving you whether you can say it back or not." Clara pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her cheek. "I'm not there yet," she admitted, "but I'm close." So close. That's enough. That's more than enough. They stood like that until the sun had fully set and the room had gone dark around them. When they finally separated, Clara felt fundamentally changed, like she'd crossed some invisible threshold and couldn't go back even if she wanted to. They moved into the house on a crisp November morning when the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. The wagon was loaded with everything they owned, which still wasn't much, and the children were vibrating with excitement. Neighbors from the Price Ranch and beyond had shown up to help, bringing food and furniture and the kind of practical support that built communities. Mrs. Price had contributed a table and chairs, beautiful pieces that had belonged to her mother. Another family brought blankets and quilts. Someone else arrived with a milk cow and 3 chickens, claiming they had extras and would Clara do them the favor of taking them off their hands. Clara knew charity when she saw it, but this felt different. This felt like welcome, like acceptance, like people investing in her success because they wanted to, not because they pitied her. The house filled quickly with noise and life and laughter. Samuel raced from room to room, claiming his corner of the children's bedroom with loud enthusiasm. Eliza set about organizing their few possessions with surprising efficiency. Thomas mostly got in everyone's way, but no one seemed to mind. By evening, the house looked lived in and loved, the kind of space that had been waiting for a family to make it complete. Clara stood in the kitchen, staring at shelves that now held dishes and cups and the jar of honey Mrs. Price had brought, and felt overwhelmed by the sheer reality of it. "You all right?" Red appeared beside her, sliding an arm around her waist with an ease that still surprised her. "I'm trying to remember the last time I felt this settled," Clara admitted. "This safe." "And?" "I'm not sure I ever have. Even before James died, there was always an edge of worry. Would the crops fail? Would we have enough? Would something happen to change everything?" She leaned into Rhett's solid warmth. "But this feels different, solid." "We built it solid," Rhett agreed. "Together." That night, after the children were asleep and the last visitors had departed, Clara and Rhett sat on their porch, and watched the moon rise over the river. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that came from 2 people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. "Remember what you told me that first day?" Clara asked eventually. "Which part? You said I'd carry your burden too." "I didn't understand what you meant at the time." Rhett was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I spent so many years trying to be strong enough, good enough, worthy enough, trying to prove I wasn't just some poor kid who'd gotten lucky. And somewhere in all that trying, I forgot that strength doesn't mean carrying everything alone. And now I know that the strongest thing I've ever done is admit I needed someone beside me." Clara reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm glad you stopped that day. Glad you didn't ride past." "Me too. Best decision I ever made." The seasons turned and the land around their home transformed with them. Winter came mild, bringing frost but no devastating storms. Clara planted winter vegetables and learned the rhythm of her new kitchen, the way light moved through the rooms at different times of day, the sounds the house made as it settled into itself. The children thrived in ways that still amazed her. Samuel finally got his riding lessons, spending hours with Rhett, learning to handle horses with the kind of patient attention that made Clara's heart swell. Eliza discovered a talent for drawing, covering pieces of scrap paper with increasingly sophisticated sketches of the landscape around them. Even Thomas grew bolder, toddling around their property with the confidence of a child who'd never known real hunger or fear. And slowly, carefully, Clara and Rhett built their marriage into something real. The physical side came gradually, Clara's comfort growing in increments until one night in January she reached for him first, and they learned the language of each other in the darkness of their bedroom with the river singing outside. It wasn't like it had been with James. This was different, more equal, more intense, more rooted in mutual desire than comfortable routine. Clara found herself wanting in ways she'd forgotten were possible, and Rhett met her desire with a reverence that made her feel precious and powerful in equal measure. By spring, the house felt like it had always been there, like they'd always been a family. Clara's garden exploded with growth as the weather warmed, providing vegetables enough to trade with neighbors and still have plenty for their own table. Rhett expanded the property, building a proper barn and acquiring livestock that turned their home into a working farm. One evening in late May, Clara stood in her garden watching the children play near the river. She was aware of Rhett approaching before he spoke, had developed that sixth sense that made her always know where he was. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Clara leaned back against him, solid and warm and utterly reliable. "I was thinking about the day you found us, how close I came to giving up, how different everything would be if you'd ridden past. But I didn't. No, you didn't." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at this man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. "And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Rhett went very still. "Say that again." "I love you," Claire repeated, stronger this time. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was when you built this house with windows positioned just right. Maybe it was when you taught Samuel to ride with so much patience. Maybe it was the first time you kissed me like I was something precious. But I know I love you, Rhett Carver, and I wanted you to hear me say it." The smile that transformed his face was worth every moment of fear and doubt and struggle it had taken to get here. He kissed her with a thoroughness that made her dizzy, and when they broke apart, both were laughing. "I love you too," Rhett said, like it was the most important thing in the world. "Have from the beginning, will until the end." Samuel's voice carried across the yard, calling for them to come see something he'd found, and they walked hand in hand toward their children, toward the life they'd built from dust and determination and the simple courage to keep trying. That night, with everyone fed and settled and the house quiet around them, Clara stood at their bedroom window looking out at the view Rhett had framed just for her. The moon painted the river silver, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called its hunting song. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, standing in the heat with 3 children and no hope left. She thought about the moment Rhett had ridden up and offered not rescue, but partnership. She thought about every choice that had led her here, to this moment, to this life. "What are you thinking about?" Rhett's voice came from the bed behind her. Clara turned, seeing him propped up on one elbow, watching her with that steady gaze that still made her heart skip. "I'm thinking about burdens, about how you said you'd carry mine, and I'd carry yours, and how it turns out we just carry them together, lighter that way, much lighter." Clara crossed to the bed, sliding under the covers and into Rhett's waiting arms. She fitted herself against him, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For stopping, for seeing me, for giving me a reason to keep walking when I was ready to lie down and quit." Rhett's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for letting me stay, for building this with me, for being brave enough to choose hope over fear." Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the river sang its endless song. Inside, 2 people who'd found each other in the dust had built something solid enough to last, something rooted deep enough to weather any storm. Clara fell asleep thinking about seeds and growth, about foundations and walls, about the courage it took to build something new from broken pieces. She fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own joys, its own small moments of grace. But tonight, wrapped in Rhett's arms in a house they'd built together, with her children safe in the next room and a future stretching bright ahead, Clara felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt complete, whole, home. Not saved, but partnered. Not rescued, but chosen. Not broken, but healing. One day at a time, with someone who understood that the journey mattered as much as the destination. As sleep pulled her under, Clara smiled, thinking about the woman who'd stood beside a broken fence with nothing left to lose, and the cowboy who'd whispered, "Let me carry your burden." They'd carried each other instead. And in that carrying, they'd built a life worth living, a complete ending, a new beginning. A story of 2 people who'd learned that sometimes the greatest strength is admitting you don't have to walk alone. And in the morning, when the sun rose over their land and painted everything gold, they'd wake up together and build another day, another week, another year of the life they'd chosen, together.